Okay, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, but a couple weeks ago I read this book, and I'm very in love with this book, so I always kind of get that way after I read a book. And that's the embarrassing part. And the book is called Lost Connections. Don't know if anybody read it, but I love it. And it's a true story of this journalist who's, since he was 18, he's battled depression. And, before that, battled depression. And the story is basically this. He battled depression, and then, they discover these pharmaceutical drugs that can help you. And so that was just this great ta-da for him. It gave him relief. But unfortunately, what he noticed is that year after year, you keep having to up the medication. So he calls it chasing the scream, because you're constantly needing more and more and more. And the third step is he comes from this epiphany that maybe depression is an incredibly healthy thing to wake you up to what's important in life. So he starts to kind of research and explore, maybe depression is really healthy and it's showing that something's missing in your life. And so he calls out lost connections. And there's a lot of research. It's not just one thing you need, it's a series of connections you need to get over some depressions. Like connecting with other people. That's incredibly important. That decreases your chance of depression by a certain percentage. Or another connection is between you and nature. People who live, no offense, in inner cities where there's not a lot of greenery or nature have a much higher rate of depression. Human beings need to be in nature. And so we need all these connections with each other, with ourselves, with nature, with our past, I would say with God. But he says at one point, he tells this story where he was close friends with this one woman in England. They're really close friends, except he admits their friendship was based really on being cynical about other people. They're both very witty, very smart, and they can make kind of funny jokes about other people. And that was kind of the core of their friendship. And so they're very kind of mocking and cynical. And she moves from England to some place called Ohio. And he visits her in Ohio, except when he visits her, it's been a couple years since they saw each other, she is completely changed. She is incredibly joyful. And she's a whole new person. So he has to ask, what changed? And she said, I realized I was so envious of other people. Whenever I'd see anybody else in my head, I'd be like, well, she's not that special. I can't even believe she's wearing that outfit. Or, all these things. And she just got tired of the cynicism and the depression and the insecurity. And so she takes up prayer and meditation. And I kind of like this part because he says, he was a confirmed atheist, so he will not pray. Even though statistically people who pray have a less chance of depression or are happier. But he's not going to pray. But he does take up meditation. And he takes up her meditation. And her meditation is called sympathetic joy, where you meditate not on your joys. You meditate on the joys of other people that happen throughout the day. You try and get into them. And after practicing this a while, she knew she'd turn this corner because she had less depression. And once she was driving by and she sees this couple who is just newly married come out. And she sees him and she starts to immediately cry because she's so overwhelmed that I love this, that they have a chance at love. And she said before she took up meditation, she would have been jealous because she hasn't found a great love in her life. And she would have been like, he's going to end up overweight and bald, or, she'll probably turn to booze, or her mind would have gone there. But now, after an extended time praying and meditating, she finds joy everywhere. It's not for her, but she sees a newly married couple, and she's overwhelmed with joy. And she says, I find joy everywhere in the world. And I love that story. So he says, well, that's a connection. Meditation is a connection. So he takes up meditation. And I'm just telling this story for this reason. Maybe there's a million reasons to be joyful in life, and you never notice it because you are stuck in kind of this bitterness or mocking or superiority that just doesn't allow you to participate. Maybe the joy is there, you're just not awake to it. And that, to me, makes a great analogy about God. Maybe God is everywhere, and without prayer and meditation, you're not awake to it. We don't pray to make God present. We pray to make ourselves present to God. God is among us. God is here. We're just not aware of it. And that reminds me of today's reading. So in today's gospel, it picks up from last week. And if you remember last week, Jesus does two amazing healings. He heals the old woman and then the little girl. And the Greek is great because he says to the little girl, he calls her my little lamb, my little sweetie, my little lamb, arise. He saves her from death. And then after that, he goes back to his mom's house, Mary's house. And even though he's done these great miracles, he goes back to his mother's house. And people they can see the miracle, but it doesn't touch them. They're really not present to it. And so they start to mock Jesus. He did something great, but they're like the woman before she took up meditation. They just mock him. When they say, isn't he the son of Mary? You have to understand, in Matthew and Mark, when it says son of Mary, that's an insult. For us, that's an honor. But at the time, that's an insult because they're reminding Jesus that there's something suspicious about his birth. Mary was pregnant before the final act of marriage. So it's a mocking that he says that. When they say, we know his brothers and sisters, people get upset by that. It could mean cousins. It's a very extended term. In the Gospel, Matthew says Mary was professional virgin, so doesn't mean Mary had other children. Well, technically the word would be family. But they say, isn't he the carpenter? And when it says carpenter, the Greek is tekton, and that basically means a laborer. It's the lowest working class. Our better word would be construction worker. He's a laborer. When they say these things, son of Mary, isn't he a carpenter? They're mocking him. Who does he think he is? Or they have kind of, if it's not mocking, it's this spirit of grandiosity where, for you to be any important, you have to come from the upper class and be showy and all this other stuff, and he's not showy. And the odd part is, for 30 years of his life, he would have been of the lower class. And, you always hear these stories of kind of made up stories. When Jesus was a child, he probably blessed mud pies and they flew off as birds. What if the opposite is true? What if God is so humble, he's found in the ordinary? Instead of people saying about Jesus as a kid, that kid was always special. Of course he's going to come out to raise the dead. What if God is so ordinary that if you're looking for something grandiose, you'll miss the presence of God? There's this German mystic from the Middle Ages, great, amazing German mystic, Meister Eckhart. And he had all these great mystical experiences, but one of them, he says, God is everywhere. God is so humble. Most people miss the presence of Christ. And he said, and I love this, he says, God is very laid back about being God. Now, when I first read that, I kind of thought, how does a German use the word laid back? I mean, no offense, culturally, they don't really seem laid back. But God is very laid back about being God. God's not into grandiosity. We are. That's a lot like the Gospel of Mark. If you spend your life mocking or always looking for kind of status symbols, what you'll miss is the very presence of God. The spirituality in the Gospel of Mark is the spirituality of being ordinary, of finding God in the ordinary. So like an example that would be like, I did this funeral for this Down syndrome girl who, before her funeral, her mother said, and I love this, her mother said, she taught me how to love. You know, with eyes open, you can see, wow, the prophet here was the girl with the Down syndrome. She taught love. Or St. Patrick. St. Patrick, if you read his confessions, said that because he came to believe in God when he was a slave in Ireland. And before that, granted his grandfather was a priest, his dad was a deacon. But when he was a slave out in the cold, he learned to pray and pray and pray. And he said, I found God in nature. So he said, I always felt better praying out in nature more than in a cathedral. Nature taught him how to pray. Or St. Paul in the second reading, where he says he has this thorn in the side. There's something about St. Paul, we don't know what it is, that he's ashamed about himself. And the odd part is his weakness, the thing that he's most ashamed about, becomes something that speaks about the very nature of God. That's a spirituality of ordinary. That ordinary things like even our insecurities, nature, a Down syndrome child, all those ordinary things can actually wake us up to the presence of God. It's like the woman in the book Lost Connections. Until she got over her cynicism and grandiosity, she couldn't find joy. Same thing for us today. If we're going to live the gospel out, it's a warning that if we live our life always needing to mock and make fun of other people or live in grandiosity, we'll miss the very presence of Christ among us. As I said, we don't pray to make God present. We pray so that we can be present to the presence of God all around us. And so, together, let us stand and pray.